21 years ago, a warning was issued. The Barker Review painted a grim picture of Britain's housing future, highlighting inadequate supply, volatile prices, and growing unaffordability. Fast forward to 2025, and the prophecy has come true in the worst possible way. In fact, the situation has deteriorated so dramatically that London's construction industry has effectively ground to a halt. Out of 1,400 development sites across the capital, only 16 have actually broken ground. The government has been forced to declare what can only be described as a housing emergency, announcing radical interventions just last month to prevent a complete collapse. This isn't just a crisis anymore. It's a catastrophe that's reshaping British society, dividing generations, and locking millions out of home ownership forever. If you're watching this, you're probably feeling the squeeze yourself or know someone who is. The statistics are brutal, but they tell a story that affects real people making impossible choices every single day. So if you want to stay informed about the latest UK property and housing news that actually impacts your life, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We cut through the noise and bring you the facts that matter. Now, let's dig into exactly how bad things have gotten. At the heart of this crisis sits a simple but devastating problem: affordability. The average home in England now costs £290,000. Sounds high, right? But here's where it gets truly alarming. The average household earns just £37,000 a year. Do the maths, and you're looking at a ratio of 7.7. That means the typical home costs nearly 8 times what a household earns annually. For most people, buying a home now requires one of 3 things: significant family wealth, dangerous levels of borrowing, or spending years, sometimes decades, saving for a deposit while watching prices climb even further out of reach. The consequences are playing out in real time. Home ownership rates have cratered from 74% to 65% in recent years. Only the richest 10% of the population can afford to buy a home on 5 years of salary. Think about that for a moment. 90% of people are effectively priced out unless they have exceptional circumstances or help. And if you're renting, you're already spending a third of your income on housing, with rents surging by nearly 9% annually. The system isn't just broken, it's actively widening inequality and threatening to split society into 2 distinct classes: those who own property and those who never will. Some people point to the past year showing marginal improvements in affordability, but this barely scratches the surface of the long-term disaster. Affordability today is worse than it was in 2004, and more than twice as bad as the 1970s. The data paints a picture of a market that has fundamentally disconnected from wage growth, leaving an entire generation stranded. But the crisis runs even deeper than numbers suggest. There's now a stark divide emerging in British society, one that's being driven by what's euphemistically called the bank of mum and dad. Over half of first-time buyers now rely on financial help from family to get on the property ladder. The statistics reveal a troubling pattern. Young buyers receiving parental assistance purchase homes at an average age of just over 30, with household incomes around £56,000. Those going it alone? They're typically over 32 years old, with higher incomes of £65,000. Yet here's the twist. Despite earning less, assisted buyers are purchasing more expensive properties thanks to significantly larger deposits. The numbers are staggering. The average deposit with family help sits at £118,073 compared to just £60,741 for those saving independently. Over the past 4 years, the Bank of Mum and Dad has provided £38.5 billion in assistance, a jaw-dropping 71% increase from the previous 4-year period. This isn't just helpful parents giving their kids a leg up. It's become a fundamental pillar holding up the entire housing market, and it's creating what experts are now calling an inheritocracy. What does that mean? Simple. Access to property is increasingly determined not by your skills, education, or hard work, but by whether your parents own property and have equity to share. If you're born into a family with housing wealth, you can access home ownership in your early 30s. If you're not, you might be waiting until your 40s, 50s, or inheriting property in your 60s, if at all. Recent research even found that stamp duty holidays disproportionately benefited those who could access the bank of mum and dad, with parents extracting equity from their own homes to help their children. This isn't a housing market anymore. It's a mechanism for entrenching generational wealth divides and creating a permanent underclass locked out of property ownership. And then there's the elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about: the massive regional divide tearing the country apart. Not all of Britain is experiencing the same crisis. In Wales and Northern Ireland, homes remain relatively affordable. Northern towns like Burnley and Blackpool have affordability ratios of just 3.9, meaning a house costs less than 4 times the average salary. Compare that to Kensington and Chelsea, where the ratio explodes to 27.1. 27 times annual income for a home. It's almost incomprehensible. London and the South East have become the epicentres of this crisis, but the problem creates a vicious cycle that's strangling opportunity. The areas with the strongest job markets, the best career prospects, and the highest wages are precisely the places where housing is least affordable. Young graduates and professionals face an impossible choice: move to London and spend £2,000 a month on rent while struggling to save anything, or stay in an affordable area and watch your career prospects evaporate. This regional imbalance points toward a potential solution that few politicians want to seriously discuss. If the economy could be genuinely rebalanced, directing high-quality jobs and investment to regions where housing remains affordable, pressure might ease. At the same time, building significantly more homes in high-growth areas could reduce the bottlenecks pushing prices into the stratosphere. But that requires political will, long-term thinking and coordination between local and national government. And right now, those things are in desperately short supply. If you think that sounds bad, wait until you hear what's happening in London. The capital's housing construction has suffered what can only be described as a catastrophic collapse. In the first quarter of 2025, just 347 affordable homes were started. By the second quarter, new starts had plummeted by 59%. Across more than a third of London's boroughs, there were 0 construction starts on major developments. 0. Out of 1,400 development sites across London, only 16 have actually begun building. The city is on track to deliver less than 5% of its annual target of 88,000 homes, by far the worst performance in 2 decades. Housing starts have fallen by more than 90% compared to just 2 years ago. Sales have collapsed to crisis levels, with only 5,933 new homes sold in the first 9 months of 2025. That's a fraction of the 22,000 per quarter needed to meet targets. At price points below £600 per square foot, where most Londoners actually buy, sales to individual owner-occupiers have been described as virtually non-existent. Industry insiders are now calling London a no-go zone for housing investment. The market hasn't just cooled, it's frozen solid. The implications are terrifying. Without new supply, London's rental market will be severely undersupplied after 2027, likely sending rents soaring even higher. Homelessness will worsen. Young workers will be pushed further out into commuter zones or simply leave the city altogether. The capital's economic productivity could suffer as businesses struggle to attract and retain talent who can't afford to live anywhere near their workplace. This isn't just a housing problem anymore. It's a threat to London's status as a global city. But why can't builders just build more homes? The answer might shock you. There are 7 major barriers strangling supply, and they're all getting worse. First, the loss of social housing. Since the 1980s, around 1.7 million council homes have been sold off through right to buy, with virtually no replacements built. That stock has never been recovered, leaving a massive hole in affordable housing provision that the private sector was never designed to fill. Second, private construction firms are profit-driven businesses. They have little incentive to build rapidly when slowly releasing homes onto the market sustains higher prices and bigger margins. Many developers prefer to sit on land with planning permissions, waiting for market conditions to maximise returns rather than actually solving the housing shortage. More than 280,000 homes across London have planning permission but remain unbuilt. These ghost sites represent thousands of families who could have homes, but don't, because it's more profitable to wait. Third, the cost of building itself has skyrocketed. Since 2000, the building cost index has surged by 140%, far outpacing general inflation. Estimates suggest constructing a 3-bed house in the UK can cost anywhere between £240,000 and £363,000. London has been ranked the second most expensive city in the world for construction. When building costs are that high, margins get squeezed and projects that might have been viable become impossible. Fourth, regulatory requirements have multiplied. New building safety regulations, while necessary, after tragedies like Grenfell, have added layers of bureaucracy and delay. The building safety regulators' processes have held up nearly 10,000 homes for more than 6 months in London alone. Dual staircase requirements, carbon offset charges, and various levies have pushed costs even higher, rendering many apartment-led schemes completely unviable. Fifth, local councils can block or delay projects even when developers want to proceed. The NIMBY reality in the UK is powerful and persistent. Residents understandably don't want their neighbourhoods transformed, creating political pressure on councillors to reject development. Planning approvals in London have plummeted to their lowest level since 2006, with just 966 projects approved in the year to June 2025. Sixth, the UK population has increased faster than expected, adding 8.1 million people since 2004. 6 million of that increase came from net migration. More people means more households needing homes, but the supply response has been nowhere near adequate to meet that demand. Seventh, the housing sector still uses largely the same labour-intensive methods as the Victorians did over a century ago. There's been remarkably little innovation or industrialisation compared to other sectors. Modular housing, factory-built components, and modern construction techniques remain relatively rare. When they are tried, results have been mixed, with several high-profile firms collapsing. The industry remains stuck in old patterns even as demand explodes. The real victims of this crisis aren't who you think. Beyond the statistics and policy debates, real human costs are mounting every single day. Young people are living at home with their parents for far longer than previous generations, not by choice, but by necessity. This delays family formation, impacts mental health, and strains family relationships. Parents who expected empty nests in their 50s find themselves still housing adult children well into their 30s. The collapse in the UK's fertility rate mirrors global trends, but housing costs are undeniably a significant factor. If you can't afford to buy or even rent a family-sized home, you delay having children. If you do settle down but face the cost difference between a 2-bed and 4-bed home, economic pressure pushes towards smaller families. These aren't abstract policy concerns. They're life decisions being shaped by a broken housing system. Meanwhile, an odd paradox persists. Over 72% of households in England have at least 2 bedrooms more than they actually need. This under-occupation typically involves older single people or couples in large family homes who find it difficult, expensive, and stressful to downsize. Higher stamp duty discourages people from moving, creating inefficiency in the market. The UK's home buying process is notoriously archaic, time-consuming, and one of the worst in the developed world. The average transaction takes over 6 months compared to just 69 days in the United States. This friction keeps people trapped in unsuitable properties, even when they might want to move. For those stuck in the private rental sector, conditions are often grim. 8% of private rentals are overcrowded, lacking sufficient bedrooms to avoid cramped living conditions. Rents have risen relentlessly, yet landlords are increasingly pulling out of the sector, often citing regulatory burdens and tax changes. There's a shift toward larger corporate landlords, but the fundamental problem remains. The sector hasn't kept pace with surging demand, creating intense price pressure that shows no signs of easing. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the homelessness crisis has exploded into a full-blown emergency. 1 in 50 Londoners is now homeless and living in temporary accommodation. That's not rough sleeping statistics. That's people in emergency B&Bs, hostels and unsuitable temporary housing. Across London, 336,366 people sit on council waiting lists for social housing, many waiting years with little hope of ever reaching the top of the list. Local councils collectively spent £2.8 billion on temporary accommodation in recent years, a staggering 180% increase over just 5 years. Of that, £844 million went to emergency B&Bs and hotels. Think about how inefficient that is. That money could have built permanent social housing, creating long-term solutions, and even generating rental income for councils. Instead, it's being burned on emergency crisis management, lining the pockets of hotel chains while failing to actually solve the problem for struggling families. The latest data shows rough sleeping itself continues to climb. The number of people forced to sleep on London's streets rose by 10% year on year, with those living on the streets long-term up 27%. Compared to a decade ago, rough sleeping has increased by 90%. These aren't just statistics. These are people, often with jobs, who simply cannot afford housing in one of the world's wealthiest cities. So is anyone actually doing anything about this? In October 2025, the government finally acknowledged the severity of the situation by announcing emergency measures for London. These aren't normal policy adjustments. They're desperate interventions to prevent complete market failure. The affordable housing requirement for new developments has been slashed from 35% to 20%, a controversial move aimed at making more projects financially viable for developers. The Mayor of London has been handed sweeping new powers to review and call in housing schemes of 50 homes or more, bypassing local planning objections. He can now act as the decision-maker on developments over 1,000 square metres on greenbelt land. The government is providing an initial £322 million to establish a City Hall Developer Investment Fund with the aim of kick-starting stalled projects. Builders will receive time-limited emergency relief from the Community Infrastructure Levy where necessary to unlock development. These measures can fast-track the planning process by up to 6 months for qualifying schemes. The government insists this emergency package will unlock tens of thousands of homes across the capital. The target remains 1.5 million new homes by 2030, with London expected to deliver 440,000 of those. But here's the harsh reality. Experts warn these targets are impossible to achieve without far more radical intervention. To meet London's requirement of 88,000 homes annually, output would need to more than double, increasing by 175%. Current trends point in completely the opposite direction. Planning permissions are at their lowest level in nearly 2 decades. Construction starts have collapsed. Developer confidence has evaporated. Industry leaders describe the market as facing a perfect storm of high interest rates, soaring material costs, labour shortages, and regulatory complexity. Since 1997, house prices have quadrupled, while incomes have merely doubled. The UK now faces an estimated shortage of more than 4 million homes. Among advanced economies, Britain has the lowest ratio of housing stock relative to population and some of the most expensive housing. The disconnect between what people earn and what homes cost has reached levels that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. The solutions exist, but they require political courage and long-term vision. Greater use of modular housing and factory-built components could dramatically reduce costs and construction times. 3D printing technology for housing remains relatively unexplored, but shows enormous potential. Some experts argue the crisis should be treated like a national emergency, similar to the post-war period when prefab housing was rapidly deployed to house families whose homes had been destroyed. Many of those supposedly temporary prefabs are still standing and occupied more than 60 years later. But innovation alone won't solve this. The UK also needs serious reform of the planning system, which remains Byzantine and inefficient. Local authorities need adequate funding and staffing to process applications quickly. The government needs to decide whether it's serious about building social housing directly or will continue the failed approach of subsidising private rents through housing benefit. Stamp duty needs reform to reduce friction in the market. The buying and selling process needs modernisation to match international standards. Most fundamentally, there needs to be an honest reckoning with the fact that housing cannot be simultaneously treated as an investment asset that perpetually increases in value and an affordable necessity that everyone can access. Those two goals are incompatible. For decades, governments of all parties have tried to square that circle, and the result is the disaster we're living through today. The housing crisis isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's reshaping British society in profound ways. It's determining who can have families and when. It's deciding which young people can pursue opportunities and which must compromise their ambitions for affordability. It's creating a two-tier system where wealth and opportunity are increasingly inherited rather than earned. It's pushing people into precarious living situations, damaging mental and physical health. It's draining billions from public budgets that could be invested in education, healthcare, or infrastructure. 21 years after the Barker Review warned this was coming, we're now living in the nightmare scenario it predicted. The question is whether we'll spend another 21 years watching things get worse, or finally summon the political will to treat this as the national crisis it truly is. The emergency measures announced last month are a start, but they're nowhere near sufficient. Without radical, sustained action, the UK housing market will continue to divide society, lock out generations, and undermine the country's economic future. The statistics are clear. The human costs are mounting. The solutions are known. What's missing is the courage to implement them. For now, millions of people remain trapped in a system that serves them poorly, watching their dreams of home ownership slip further away with each passing year. That's the state of UK housing in 2025, and unless something changes dramatically, it's only going to get worse.